A marriage, Jessica whispered, the words slicing through the veranda's quiet like a vow finally allowed to breathe. Do-hyun froze beside her, his hand tightening around hers. Say it again, he demanded, voice raw, stripped of every careful calculation he'd built his life on. A real one, she said, steady now, fierce, built honestly, and this time I want the whole city to know it. Something cracked open across his face, unguarded, almost boyish. Joy he'd locked away so long he'd forgotten it still worked. Below them, autumn crickets sang themselves hoarse. But inside, baby Faith slept, unaware her parents had just rewritten her entire world. He lifted her hand to his lips, kissed her knuckles slow and certain. I want a wedding, Jessica. The one you never got to have. I don't need 300 guests whispering behind their hands, she warned. I just need it real, he vowed, all the way through, because this time nothing would stand between them. Not danger, not the past, not anyone who dared call her replaceable again. Welcome to AfroKorean Romance Stories, besties. Please like, share, and hit that subscribe button right now if you haven't already. And drop a comment below telling us where you are watching from and what time it is over there. Before we begin, if you can't get enough of Afro-Korean Mafia Boss romances, you'll love my Ultimate Mafia Boss Love Collection. It includes 15 complete stories, 20 audiobooks, and 5 exclusive bonus stories you won't find on YouTube. Simply click the link in the description, or if you're watching on a TV, pause the video and open your phone's camera and point it at the QR code on your screen. It takes just seconds. If you were with us for the first part of this story, you already know exactly how far these two people have come to arrive at this exact moment, and I promise you, what happens over the next hour is going to make you fall in love with them all over again. Now, let's enjoy today's unforgettable story. Do-hyun did not kiss her that night. He wanted to. She could see it plainly in the way his eyes moved to her mouth, and then, deliberately, away again. But he was a man who had learned, across a year of careful partnership, exactly how much weight a first kiss could carry when it arrived between two people who had built their entire relationship on the discipline of never rushing anything. Instead, he lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, slow and certain. The same gesture he'd offered her on the night she signed their original terms, except this time it meant something entirely different, and they both knew it. I want to do this properly, he said quietly. Not the way we did it before. No quiet ceremony witnessed by a small circle whose only purpose was sending a message to people we don't even like. I want a wedding, Jessica, the kind you never got to have the first time, before everything went wrong. I want you to have that. I already had a wedding, she said, and something dry crept into her voice, the particular gallows humor she'd learned to wear like armor over the last year. It didn't go especially well for me. I know, Do-hyun said, and he did not flinch from it the way a lesser man might have, did not rush to smooth over the memory or pretend it hadn't happened, which is exactly why I want to give you a different one. Not to erase what happened. I don't think that's possible, and I don't think you'd want it erased even if it were. But to prove to you, in front of every single person who matters to either of us, that what's happening between us now is not a repeat of anything. It's its own thing, entirely. Jessica studied him in the last of the evening light. This careful, deliberate man who had once told her both things could be true, that he was helping her out of decency and out of strategy in equal measure, and who had somehow, across a year of quiet consistency, become someone whose ratio had shifted so completely that he was now sitting on a veranda proposing a real wedding with the same steady conviction he brought to everything else in his life. Okay, she said finally, and she felt the word land somewhere warm in her chest. Let's do it properly then. But Do-hyun, I want you to understand something first. Anything. I don't need a fairy tale, she said. I don't need a fairy tale, she said. I don't need a fairy tale. 300 guests, and a string quartet, and a room full of people whispering behind their hands about whether I belong there. I had that once, and I know exactly what it's worth, which is nothing, when the man standing across from you doesn't mean a single word of what he's saying. I just need it to be real. Small, if it has to be. Quiet, if that's safer. But real, all the way through. Then that's exactly what it will be, Do-hyun said. And there was something in his voice now that she recognized from every promise he'd ever kept. A steadiness that had never once wavered in the year she'd known him. Real, all the way through. I give you my word. They told Faith the next morning, or tried to, though at not quite 14 months old. Their daughter's understanding of the announcement extended mainly to the fact that her father was smiling more than usual, and had let her chew on his tie during breakfast without a single word of protest, which she took, correctly, as evidence that something good was happening in the household, even if the specifics were beyond her. Mrs. Yoon, when she heard, set down the teapot she was carrying with such sudden emotion that Jessica genuinely worried for a moment the older woman might drop it entirely, and then she simply stood in the kitchen doorway, with both hands pressed to her mouth, her eyes bright, saying nothing at all, for nearly a full minute. "Forgive me," Mrs. Yoon said finally, wiping at her eyes with the corner of her apron. "I have worked in this house for many years, Mrs. Choi, and I have never once seen Master Do-hyun look at anyone the way he looks at you. Not before you arrived. I did not think I would live to see it, honestly, and now I am standing here crying over breakfast rice, like a foolish old woman." "You're not foolish," Jessica said, crossing the kitchen to embrace her, feeling the older woman's shoulders shake slightly beneath her arms. "You're the only person who was kind to me on the worst night of my life, Mrs. Yoon. If anyone has earned the right to cry about this, it's you." The trouble arrived, as trouble in that particular world always did, quietly at first, through a phone call that Do-hyun took in his study with the door closed. The kind of call Jessica had learned, over a year of marriage, to recognize by the particular stillness that settled over the house afterward. She found him standing at his desk an hour later, his hands braced flat against the wood, staring down at nothing, and something in the set of his shoulders told her immediately that whatever had been said on that call was not the kind of news either of them could simply set aside. "Who was that?" she asked, closing the study door behind her. "Elder Baek," Do-hyun said, and something in the way he said the name, careful and controlled in the particular way he reserved for people who genuinely mattered to be careful about, told Jessica this was not a name she should treat lightly. "He sits on the founding council, one of the last 3 men alive who was present when the old agreements were originally drafted, 4 generations back. He has more influence over how the network's older families think about legitimacy and succession than almost anyone else currently living." "And what did he want?" Do-hyun was quiet for a long moment, and Jessica watched him choose his words the way he always did, before delivering something difficult, weighing each one before he let it out into the room. "He wants to meet with me," he said finally, formally. "Before the wedding takes place, not after." He was very specific about the timing. "Why does the timing matter?" "Because right now," Do-hyun said, "I am a man who married a woman for strategic reasons that everyone in our world understood and, frankly, respected. Protection for you and Faith, a wound inflicted on arrival, leverage secured through a legitimate bloodline claim. Cold, calculated, entirely within the logic of how our world operates. Nobody questioned it, because it made sense to them. He looked up at her finally, and something careful entered his eyes. But a man who marries that same woman a second time, for love, publicly, in front of every family that matters, is telling the entire network something very different. He's telling them his priorities have shifted, that the calculations that used to govern every decision he makes might not govern this one. And in a world built entirely on the assumption that everyone is always calculating something, Jessica, a man who stops calculating, becomes unpredictable. Unpredictable men make the founding families nervous. Jessica crossed the room slowly and settled into the chair across from his desk. The same chair, she realized, where she had once sat across from him negotiating the terms of a marriage built entirely on protection and leverage, and felt the particular vertigo of watching history repeat itself in an entirely different key. "So they think you're becoming a liability," she said, "because you're happy." "They think I'm becoming unpredictable," Do-hyun corrected gently, "which in their world is the same thing as being a liability, whether or not it's fair. Elder Beck has never fully trusted me, if I'm honest with you. My father built alliances with the founding families through decades of careful, patient loyalty. I inherited that trust, but I never fully earned it the way he did. And there are men on that council who have been waiting for an excuse to question whether I deserve the standing I currently hold." He paused. "A real marriage, built on love instead of strategy, gives them exactly the kind of excuse they've been waiting for." "What does he actually want?" Jessica asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer wasn't going to be simple. "I don't know yet," Do-hyun admitted. "He wouldn't say over the phone, which tells me, honestly, that whatever it is, he wants to watch my face while he says it." He straightened, and something in his posture shifted back into the composed, deliberate authority she'd first met at the Hanok Gate over a year ago. The version of him that had learned, across decades in this world, exactly how to carry himself into a room full of people testing his resolve. "The meeting is in 3 days. I'd like you to come with me." "You want me at a meeting with the man questioning whether your marriage is a liability?" "I want him to see exactly who he's questioning," Do-hyun said, and something fierce and quiet entered his voice. The particular protective steadiness she had come to associate with him over the past year, the same steadiness that had once made her feel, for the first time in longer than she could remember, genuinely safe. "Because I think, Jessica, that Elder Bake has built his entire understanding of you out of second-hand gossip and outdated assumptions. And I think the moment he actually sits across from you and listens to you speak, he is going to understand exactly why I stopped calculating the moment I met you." That evening, after Faith had been settled for the night and the house had gone quiet around them, Jessica found herself sitting across from Do-hyun at the low table in the sitting room, the same table where they had first negotiated the terms of their strategic marriage, and something about the symmetry of it made her want to ask him a question she had been holding back for months, ever since the first time she'd caught him staring at nothing with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "About before all of this? Before me." Do-hyun looked up from the papers he'd been reading, something careful entering his expression. The particular guardedness she'd learned to recognize whenever the conversation moved toward territory he didn't visit often. "You can ask me anything," he said. "I told you I would never lie to you. That includes the things I'd rather not talk about. You said once that you watched Tae-main become someone who lies to the people who trust him most, and that you'd spent a long time deciding you didn't want to become that kind of man yourself." Jessica watched his face carefully as she spoke. "But you said it like it came from somewhere specific." Like you'd learned that lesson the hard way, not just by watching him. Do-hyun set his papers down slowly, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, simply looked at the low flame of the lantern between them, the shadows it threw across the wooden floor. There was a woman, he said finally, quietly, before you. Her name was Soo-jin. I was 26. My father had just died, and I had inherited more of the network's holdings than any 26-year-old has any business managing. And everyone around me, every single person in my world, was suddenly very interested in who I might marry, because whoever I married was going to inherit an enormous amount of influence alongside me. He paused, and something old and careful moved behind his eyes. I thought Soo-jin loved me. I believed it completely, the way you believe things when you're young enough and grieving enough to need very badly for them to be true. What happened? She was working for a rival faction the entire time, Do-hyun said, his voice perfectly level, the particular flatness of a man who had rehearsed telling this story so many times to himself, alone, in the dark, that he'd worn all the rawness out of it years ago. Feeding them information about my father's holdings, about which alliances were vulnerable, about exactly where to apply pressure once he was gone, and I was too grief-stricken to notice the walls were being quietly dismantled around me. I found out 3 weeks before we were supposed to marry. I found out, Jessica, because one of my father's oldest allies pulled me aside at a dinner and told me, gently, the way you tell a young man something that's about to destroy him, that the woman I loved had been lying to me for over a year. Jessica felt something tighten in her chest, watching him tell this story with such careful, practiced calm, understanding suddenly, completely, exactly why a man who ran a significant portion of the network's influence had spent years afterward building himself into someone who never rushed anything, who told the truth even when it cost him, who had negotiated their entire arrangement with such deliberate transparency that it had felt, at the time, almost suspicious in its honesty. I'm so sorry, she said quietly. Don't be, Do-hyun said, and something almost gentle entered his voice. It taught me something I needed to learn eventually anyway, which is that in our world, the people closest to you are often the ones with the most opportunity to hurt you, and the only real protection against that is choosing, deliberately, every single day, to be someone who doesn't lie, even when lying would be easier. I decided a long time ago that I would rather be alone and honest than loved and deceived. He looked at her steadily. And then you walked into my life on the worst night of yours, negotiating terms like a woman who had learned exactly the same lesson I had. And I understood, somewhere very early on, that I had finally found someone who wasn't going to make me choose between those two things anymore. 3 days later, Jessica dressed carefully for the meeting with Elder Baek, choosing a deep charcoal suit that Do-hyun had quietly had tailored for her over the past month, the kind of understated, expensive precision that spoke a language every member of the founding families would understand instantly, without a single word needing to be exchanged. Faith stayed home with Mrs. Yoon, and as the car pulled away from the Hanok estate, Jessica felt Do-hyun's hand find hers on the seat between them, steady and certain, the way it had found hers a year ago in a different car on a different night. Except everything about the feeling of it now was entirely different. Whatever he says, Do-hyun said quietly, I need you to remember something. You do not need his approval. Neither of us does. But I would like him to understand exactly who he's dealing with. Because men like Elder Baek have spent their entire lives underestimating people. And I have watched you dismantle that particular mistake in every single room you've ever walked into. The meeting was held not at the Hanok estate, and not at any of the glass towers that housed the network's legitimate business interests, but at a private, unmarked building in a quiet section of the city that Jessica had never had reason to visit before. The kind of place that existed specifically for conversations nobody wanted recorded or witnessed by anyone outside a very particular circle. Elder Bake was waiting for them in a sparse, elegant room furnished with almost nothing beyond a low table and 3 cushions. And Jessica understood, the moment she saw him, exactly the kind of man Do-hyun had been describing. He was perhaps 80 years old, small and spare in the way of men who had spent decades disciplining their bodies as rigorously as their minds. With sharp, assessing eyes that moved over Jessica the moment she entered the room and did not stop moving until he had, she suspected, catalogued everything about her worth cataloging. He did not stand when they entered. He simply gestured, with a single economical motion, toward the cushions across from him, and waited. "Mrs. Choi," he said, once they were seated, his voice dry and precise, carrying the particular authority of a man who had never once in his life needed to raise it to be obeyed. "I've heard a great deal about you over the past year. Most of it, I confess, I did not entirely believe. And now that I'm sitting in front of you," Jessica said, meeting his gaze directly, refusing to let the particular chill of the room settle into her voice. "What do you believe?" Something flickered behind Elder Baek's eyes, brief and unreadable, and for a long moment he did not answer her at all, simply studied her the way, she imagined, he had studied 1,000 other people who had walked into rooms like this one, hoping to survive whatever conversation was about to happen. "I believe," he said finally, "that we have a great deal to discuss, Mrs. Choi. And I believe, before this conversation is finished, we are going to find out exactly how much steel is actually underneath everything I've heard about you." Jessica did not look away from him. She had learned, over a year of navigating rooms exactly like this one, that men like Elder Bake respected almost nothing as much as they respected a person who refused to shrink under scrutiny, and so she simply held his gaze and let the silence stretch, the same silence she had once stood inside on the worst night of her life, except this time it did not feel like violence. This time it felt like a test she intended to pass. "Ask me whatever you came here to ask," she said. "I didn't come to be studied from a distance, Elder Bake. I came to answer your questions directly, the same way I've answered every difficult question anyone has put in front of me since the night I arrived in this city with nothing but a suitcase and a degree nobody in Seoul particularly respected." Something shifted behind the old man's eyes, and for the first time since they'd entered the room, he allowed the faintest suggestion of a smile to touch the corner of his mouth. Brief and dry, gone almost as quickly as it arrived. "Very well," he said. "Let us begin with the question every man on that council is currently asking, whether or not they have the courage to ask it directly." He turned his attention fully toward Do-hyun now, and something in his posture sharpened, the careful stillness of a man about to test the exact strength of a bridge before he decided whether to trust his weight to it. "You intend to marry this woman a second time, publicly, for reasons the founding families are going to interpret, whether you like it or not, as a departure from everything your father built his reputation on." "My father built his reputation on loyalty," Do-hyun said, his voice even, unhurried, "not on the absence of feeling. I don't believe those two things were ever supposed to be opposites, Elder Beck, no matter how long this council has spent pretending otherwise." "A dangerous belief," Elder Beck said quietly, "for a man in your position to hold." He turned back to Jessica, and something in his expression sharpened further, the particular focus of a man closing in on the actual point of the conversation at last. "Because if I am being entirely honest with you both, My concern is not whether Choi Do-hyun loves you, Mrs. Choi. I have watched enough men love foolishly in my lifetime to know it changes nothing about how carefully the rest of us must plan around it." He paused, and the room went very still around his next words. "My concern is what happens to this family, and to that council seat your daughter is now entitled to claim, if this marriage does not survive the very particular pressures that come from making it public. Because there are people in this city, Mrs. Choi, who would very much like to see exactly that happen. And I am not entirely convinced either of you understands yet how far some of them are prepared to go to make it happen." Jessica felt the words settle into the room like something cold dropped into still water. And beside her, she felt Do-hyun go very slightly, very carefully still. The particular stillness she had learned over a year to recognize as controlled fury rather than surprise. "Which people?" he said, and his voice had lost none of its evenness. But something underneath it had sharpened into a blade Jessica had only heard him use twice before in the time she'd known him. "Be specific, Elder Bake. You did not summon us to this room to speak in riddles." "I summoned you to this room," Elder Beck said, folding his hands together on the low table between them, "because I am an old man who has watched 3 generations of ambitious young men underestimate exactly how patient their enemies can be. There is a faction within the founding families, Choi Do-hyun, that has never fully accepted your rise to the standing you currently hold. They watched your father earn his place across 40 years of careful loyalty, and they have spent the better part of a decade waiting for evidence that his son inherited the position without earning the temperament required to keep it. And they see my marriage as that evidence," Do-hyun said flatly. "They see an opportunity," Elder Bake corrected. "A public wedding, built on sentiment rather than strategy, announced to every family that matters, is precisely the kind of moment men like that wait for. It gives them a stage, a visible point of vulnerability. And I would be doing neither of you any favors if I allowed you to walk into that wedding, believing the only danger you face is my own counsel's disapproval." He looked between them, and something almost like weariness crossed his ancient, careful face. "There is a man named Cho Young-tae. Perhaps you've heard the name." Do-hyun's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I know exactly who he is." "Then you know he has spent the last several years quietly building alliances among the families who resent how much of the network's legitimate business interests now flow through your hands rather than theirs," Elder Bake said. "He has not moved openly, because openly moving against you, particularly now, with a legitimate heir sitting inside your household, would be seen by the rest of the council as reckless. But a wedding, Choi Do-hyun, is not an act of open aggression. It is an occasion. And occasions, in our world, have a long and unfortunate history of becoming the exact moment ambitious men choose to make their move, precisely because everyone's guard is lowered in service of celebration." Jessica felt something tighten low in her stomach, the particular fear she had trained herself, over the past year, not to show on her face regardless of how loudly it moved through her. "Are you telling us," she said carefully, "that our wedding might be dangerous? Not politically, actually dangerous?" Elder Bake turned to look at her fully, and something in his expression softened. Fractionally, the closest thing to genuine concern she had seen from him since they'd entered the room. "I am telling you, Mrs. Choi, that I have lived a very long time in a world where the line between politically dangerous and actually dangerous has never been as clean as people would prefer to believe. I am not here to frighten you unnecessarily. I am here because I respect your husband's father enough to want his son to walk into this wedding with his eyes fully open, rather than discovering the danger the way young men in our world too often do, which is to say, too late to do anything meaningful about it. The car ride home was quiet, in a way that felt entirely different from the comfortable silences Jessica had grown used to sharing with Do-hyun over the past year. She watched him stare out the window at the passing city, his jaw set, his hands folded together with a stillness that told her he was running through calculations she couldn't fully follow. And finally, unable to sit inside the silence any longer, she reached over and covered his hand with hers. "Talk to me," she said. "Whatever you're working through right now, I'd rather hear it than watch you carry it alone." Do-hyun exhaled slowly, and something in his shoulders eased, fractionally. The particular release she had learned meant he was choosing honesty over protective silence, a choice she knew did not come naturally to him even now, even after everything they'd built together. "Cho Young-tae has wanted what I have for a very long time," he said. "Not you, specifically. Not at first. He wanted the standing my father built, the influence, the particular respect the older families extend to the Choi name. When my father died, and I inherited all of it at 28, younger than anyone expected, younger than Cho Young-tae himself was when he first tried to claim a seat at that same table, he took it personally, in a way I don't think he's ever fully recovered from. And now Faith's bloodline claim gives him a reason to move against you specifically," Jessica said slowly, working through the logic the way she'd learned to work through every problem this world put in front of her, methodically, without flinching from the uncomfortable parts. "Because if something happened to weaken your position, right when the founding council is already re-evaluating succession claims because of Faith, he'd be positioned to benefit more than almost anyone else." "Yes," Do-hyun said, and something in his voice carried a quiet, painful pride. The particular pride of a man watching the woman he loved understand, immediately and completely, a threat that had taken him years of hard experience to learn to see clearly. "Exactly that." "Then we don't cancel the wedding," Jessica said, and there was no hesitation in her voice at all. The particular steel elder bike had come looking for, and, she suspected, had found exactly where he expected to find it. "We don't hide, and we don't let a man like that dictate how we live our lives, not after everything we've already survived to get here. But we go into it with our eyes open, exactly like Elder Bake said. We plan around the danger instead of pretending it doesn't exist." Do-hyun turned to look at her fully then, something in his expression shifting into an admiration so plain and unguarded that Jessica felt her own breath catch slightly at the sight of it. "You are entirely unafraid of this world," he said quietly. "Do you know that about yourself? I have watched some of the most powerful men in this city flinch under far less pressure than what Elder Bake just described to us. And you sat there and asked him direct questions, like you were negotiating a business contract." "I am afraid," Jessica said honestly. "I'm terrified, if I'm being completely honest with you. But I learned something on the night you found me on that street, Do-hyun. Something I've carried with me every single day since. Fear doesn't have to be the thing that decides what happens next. It can just be a feeling I have, while I decide something else entirely." He lifted her hand to his lips then, right there in the back of the moving car, and pressed a kiss to her knuckles that felt entirely different from every careful, measured gesture that had come before it, something raw and certain underneath the tenderness of it. "Marry me properly," he said quietly. "Soon. Not because I'm trying to outrun Cho Young-tae or prove anything to Elder Baek's council, because I don't want to wait one more day than I have to before I get to call you my wife in every sense of the word, instead of only the sense we built out of necessity." "I already said yes," Jessica reminded him, smiling despite everything, despite the weight of the conversation they just walked out of. "I know," Do-hyun said. I just wanted to hear myself ask properly. The first time, I believe I simply asked what you wanted to call our arrangement. That is not, in retrospect, a proposal any reasonable woman should have to accept as romantic. Jessica laughed, real and unguarded, the sound surprising them both, after the tension of the meeting they just left. And something about hearing that laugh seemed to loosen something in Do-hyun's chest as well. His own quiet, rare smile spreading slowly across his face in response. For the record, she said, I thought it was perfectly romantic. In its own way. You were very thorough about the terms. I am going to spend the rest of my life being teased about the terms, Do-hyun said, shaking his head, though there was nothing but warmth in it. Absolutely, Jessica agreed. Every anniversary. I hope you're prepared. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm Jessica had never quite experienced before. Not even in the earliest, most hopeful days of her marriage to Taemin. A rhythm built on the particular joy of preparing for something both of them genuinely wanted, rather than something either of them felt obligated to perform. Mrs. Yoon threw herself into wedding preparations with an energy that seemed to grow more youthful by the day, insisting on overseeing every detail personally, from the specific shade of the silk Jessica would wear to the exact arrangement of flowers that would line the Hanok Estate's courtyard, muttering under her breath the entire time about how this time, at least, someone in this house was finally doing things properly. Faith, now closer to 15 months old, and delighted by the sudden flurry of activity in her home, had taken to toddling after Mrs. Yoon through every room of estate preparations, occasionally grabbing at swatches of fabric or attempting, with great determination and limited success, to help carry flowers far too large for her small hands. And Jessica found herself, more than once, simply standing in a doorway, watching her daughter and Do-hyun's household staff move through the joyful chaos of wedding preparations, feeling something in her chest she still, even now, had trouble finding adequate words for. But beneath the joy, a quieter work was happening as well, one Jessica participated in fully, refusing, as she had refused from the very first night in that Hanok sitting room, to be managed or protected from information that concerned her own safety and her daughter's. Do-hyun's security teams doubled their presence around the estate without announcement, careful and unobtrusive in the way of professionals who understood the value of vigilance that didn't announce itself as fear. Guest lists for the wedding were reviewed and re-reviewed, cross-referenced against known associations with Cho Young-tae's faction, quietly adjusted in ways that would be invisible to anyone not specifically looking for the pattern. I want you to understand something, Do-hyun told her one evening, nearly 3 weeks before the wedding date, as they sat together reviewing the final guest list at the low table in the sitting room. I am not doing any of this because I believe Cho Young-tae will actually attempt something as crude as violence at our wedding. Men like him rarely operate that directly. Not against someone with my standing, not without overwhelming provocation. His methods tend towards something subtler. Information leaked at precisely the wrong moment. A carefully placed rumor designed to fracture an alliance. The kind of damage that looks, from the outside, like simple bad luck, rather than deliberate sabotage. So what are we actually protecting against? Jessica asked, watching him carefully. Anything that could be used to suggest the marriage itself is unstable, Do-hyun said. Anything that could feed the narrative Elder Baek warned us about, that I've become unpredictable, emotionally compromised, less capable of managing my responsibilities than my father was. If Cho Young-tae can plant even a small seed of doubt among the founding families, doubt about whether I'm still the man they can trust, with the standing I currently hold, he doesn't need violence at all. He simply needs patience and the right moment to let that doubt grow. Jessica considered this for a long moment, turning it over the way she turned over every strategic problem this world had taught her to recognize, methodically, refusing to let fear cloud her thinking. "Then we don't give him a moment," she said finally. "We make this wedding so obviously, unmistakably solid that there's no seed for him to plant. We show every single person in that room, and everyone who hears about it afterward, exactly what real partnership looks like. So thoroughly that doubting it becomes absurd." Something in Do-hyun's expression shifted into the particular warm admiration she had come to treasure more than almost anything else in her life, the look of a man who had genuinely stopped expecting to be surprised by the depth of a partner's strength and kept finding himself surprised anyway. "I married a strategist," he said quietly, shaking his head slightly. "I keep forgetting that, somewhere in the middle of falling in love with you, and then you say something like that, and I remember all over again. You married a strategist who is also, apparently, about to become your wife for the second time," Jessica said, leaning into him slightly, feeling the particular ease that had grown between them over the past year, settle warm and certain in her chest. "I'd say that's a fairly good trade. Enjoying the story so far? And then you'll love my ultimate Mafia Boss Love Collection, featuring 15 complete stories, 20 audiobooks, and 5 exclusive bonus stories you can't get on YouTube, which you can enjoy anytime. Just click the link below, or scan the QR code by pausing the video, opening your phone's camera, and pointing it at your TV or screen. Your next favorite romance could be waiting for you before this story even ends." 2 days before the wedding, however, the quiet, careful preparations were disrupted by a call that arrived not from Elder Beck and not from any of the security contacts Do-hyun had quietly deployed across the city, but from a number Jessica recognized instantly and had hoped, somewhere in the private hopeful part of herself, she would never have to see flash across her screen again. Han Yoo-jin was calling. Jessica stared at the screen for a long moment before she answered, feeling the particular vertigo of a name from her old life, reaching backward into the one she'd built without it. "Hello," she said carefully. "Jessica." Yoo-jin's voice sounded different than Jessica remembered, less polished, less certain, carrying something underneath it that sounded almost like nerves. "I know I'm the last person you probably want to hear from. I know that. But I need to tell you something, and I need you to actually listen before you hang up. Because I don't think anyone else is going to tell you this in time." "You have 30 seconds, Jessica said. And Do-hyun, seated beside her, went very still, watching her face for whatever he could read in it. "My husband's family does business with Cho Young-tae's people," Yoo-jin said quickly, the words tumbling out of her with a speed that suggested she'd rehearsed them and was afraid of losing her nerve before she finished. "I overheard something last week, a conversation I wasn't supposed to hear, about your wedding, about someone planning to be there who isn't on any guest list. Choi Do-hyun's people approved. I don't know all the details. I only know it frightened me enough that I couldn't stop thinking about it. And I know exactly what it feels like to sit somewhere and know something terrible is coming and say nothing because it's easier." A pause, and something raw entered her voice. "I've had a year to think about the kind of person I was, Jessica. I'm not calling because I think you owe me forgiveness. I'm calling because I don't want to be that person again." Jessica felt something complicated move through her chest, gratitude tangled together with old, unresolved hurt. And beside her, Do-hyun's hand found hers, steady and grounding. "What exactly did you hear?" she asked quietly. "A name," Yoo-jin said. "Someone Cho Young-tae's people were arranging to have added to the catering staff. Not a guest, staff, Jessica. Someone who'd have access to the kitchens, to the private areas, to places security wouldn't think twice about. I don't know what they're planning. I only know it isn't nothing, and I know if something happened at that wedding and I'd said nothing, I don't think I could live with that, on top of everything else I already have to live with. Do-hyun was already moving, already reaching for his own phone, and Jessica understood, watching the controlled urgency settle over him, that whatever came next was going to happen very quickly. "Yoo-jin," Jessica said, before the call ended. "Thank you. I mean that. Have a beautiful wedding," Yoo-jin said, and something in her voice cracked slightly around the words. "You deserve one, Jessica. I hope you know that, whatever else is true between us." The next 36 hours moved with the particular controlled intensity Jessica had learned, over a year in this world, to recognize as Do-hyun operating at his absolute sharpest. Every conversation clipped and purposeful, every decision made with a speed that belied how carefully each one had actually been considered. The catering staff for the wedding was quietly, entirely replaced. Sourced instead from a company Do-hyun's most trusted allies had vetted personally over the years. Every vendor scheduled to enter the estate in the final 2 days before the ceremony was cross-checked against records reaching back further than Jessica had known Do-hyun's people even kept. And on the morning of the wedding itself, walking the grounds one final time before guests began to arrive, Do-hyun's head of security approached him quietly and murmured something that made his jaw tighten before he simply nodded once, dismissed the man, and turned to find Jessica watching him from across the courtyard. "They found him," he said simply, crossing to her. The man Cho Young-tae's people arranged to place among the staff. He was intercepted before he ever set foot on the grounds. "There will be no incident today, Jessica. I give you my word." Something in Jessica's chest loosened, a tension she hadn't fully allowed herself to feel until the moment it released. And Cho Young-tae? We'll discover, very shortly, that his patience just cost him considerably more than he intended to risk, Do-hyun said, and something quiet and formidable moved behind his eyes. The particular expression of a man who had spent a year building an entirely peaceful life, and had just been reminded, sharply, of exactly how effective he remained at protecting it. Today is not the day to discuss what happens to him. Today, Jessica, is the day I finally get to marry you properly, in front of everyone who matters, without a single shadow hanging over it. Let me have that. Let us both have that. If you've been holding your breath through the last several minutes, you can finally exhale. Because I promise you, what happens next is exactly the moment this entire story has been building toward, and it is every bit as beautiful as these two people have earned. Before we get into it, drop a comment telling me if you saw Yoo-jin's redemption coming, because honestly, some of you called it in the comments on part 1, and I love that you're paying that close attention. Now, let's give Jessica and Do-hyun the wedding they deserve. The Hanok Estate's courtyard had been transformed entirely from the quiet, careful space Jessica had first stood in a year and a half earlier, barefoot and shaking, uncertain whether she'd walked into safety or into something far more complicated. Now it glowed with soft lantern light strung between the ancient pine trees, hundreds of white and gold blossoms woven through the wooden lattice archways Mrs. Yoon had insisted on personally, and rows of guests, smaller and far more carefully chosen than the glittering crowd that had once watched her humiliation unfold, seated in quiet anticipation as the late afternoon light softened toward evening. Jessica stood at the edge of the courtyard, in a gown that bore no resemblance to the pale blue dress she'd once worn to her own destruction. Deep ivory silk with delicate gold embroidery along the sleeves that Mrs. Yoon had commissioned from a designer she'd known for 30 years. Her hair swept back in a style that left her face entirely visible, entirely unhidden, because this time, she had decided, she wanted every single person in that courtyard to see her clearly. Faith, dressed in a small matching gown that made her look, Jessica thought, entirely too pleased with herself, toddled at the front of the small processional, scattering flower petals with the enthusiastic, uneven abandon of a 15-month-old who understood only that this was fun and that everyone kept smiling at her for doing it. And at the end of the aisle, beneath an archway heavy with white blossoms, Do-hyun waited, dressed in a formal black hanbok-inspired suit that caught the lantern light exactly the way Taemin's silk once had, in a different hall entirely, except everything about the way Do-hyun stood there, watching her walk toward him, was different in every way that mattered. There was no cold calculation in his eyes. There was no careful public performance. There was only him, entirely open, entirely present, watching her the way she had once, a lifetime ago, hoped someone would watch her and be looking at her exactly right, at last. The officiant spoke words neither of them had chosen from any traditional script. Words Do-hyun had written himself over the preceding weeks and shared with no one, not even Jessica, insisting he wanted her to hear them for the first time in this exact moment, standing across from him with the whole of Seoul's oldest, most careful world watching. When it came time for him to speak, he took both her hands in his and held her gaze steadily, the way he held everything that mattered to him. "I did not fall in love with you gradually," he said, his voice carrying clear and certain across the quiet courtyard. "I want to correct something I told myself for months, something I let myself believe because it felt safer than the truth. I told myself I fell in love with you slowly, somewhere around the third week, the way you'd expect a careful man to fall in love, cautiously, incrementally. But that was never true, Jessica. I fell in love with you the moment you stood on that cold street and told me, before you'd even met me, that you were done trusting men who claimed to have your best interests at heart. I fell in love with a woman who had just lost everything and still had the courage to negotiate her own terms rather than simply accept whatever was offered to her." He paused, and something raw and unguarded moved across his composed face. "I promise you, in front of everyone who matters to either of us, that I will spend the rest of my life being worthy of that courage. I will never once make you a line in a strategy. I will never once call you replaceable, in this life or any other. You are the truest thing that has ever happened to me, and I intend to spend every single day proving I know exactly how rare that is." Jessica felt tears she made no effort to hide slip down her cheeks, and when it came time for her own words, she found her voice steadier than she expected, carrying the particular clarity that had carried her through every difficult moment since that first devastating night. "A year and a half ago," she said, "I stood in a doorway and let a man's words settle into my bones like cold water, and I promised myself, standing there, that I would never again let anyone else decide what I was worth." She looked at Do-hyun, at Faith standing beside them clutching a fistful of remaining flower petals, at Mrs. Yoon crying openly in the front row, and felt the whole of everything she'd survived settle, finally, into something that felt entirely like peace. "You never once tried to decide that for me. You gave me terms, and then you honored every single one of them. And somewhere in the middle of that honesty, I found something I genuinely did not believe I would ever be brave enough to trust again. I choose you, Do-hyun, not because I need protecting anymore, because I want to build the rest of my life with a man who has never once given me a reason to doubt him. That is the truest kind of love I know how to offer, and I am giving it to you completely." When the officiant pronounced them married, properly, publicly, in front of every single person whose opinion had once mattered enormously to the world, Do-hyun came from. He kissed her, the way he had wanted to kiss her on that veranda weeks earlier, and had, with careful discipline, held himself back from. Slow and certain and entirely unhurried, the kind of kiss that made the assembled crowd erupt into applause loud enough that Faith, startled, began clapping along with enthusiastic confusion, which only made the laughter that followed warmer still. Mrs. Yoon, when Jessica embraced her afterward, was crying so hard she could barely speak, clutching Jessica's hands in both of hers with a fierce, grateful grip. "I told you," she managed finally, through the tears. "I told you I had never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you. Now the whole world has seen it too." Even Elder Baek, seated in a place of quiet honor near the front, approached them once the formal proceedings had given way to the warmer, looser energy of celebration, moving with the same deliberate economy he brought to everything, and studied Jessica for a long moment before he spoke. "I came here prepared to watch a wedding I feared might become a liability," he said, his dry voice carrying none of its earlier chill. "Instead, Mrs. Choi, I believe I have just watched the exact kind of alliance our founding families should have been building for generations. If any of us had possessed the wisdom to recognize it when we saw it." He inclined his head slightly, the closest thing to a bow Jessica suspected he offered anyone. "You have my respect, both of you. That is not something I extend easily, and I would ask that you understand exactly what it means when I do." "Thank you, Elder Baek," Jessica said, and found she meant it entirely. "For today, and for the warning that made today possible. Cho Young-tae will be dealt with appropriately," Elder Baek said, something cold and final entering his voice for just a moment, before it smoothed back into formal courtesy. "The founding council does not look kindly on men who bring danger to a wedding, regardless of what he believed he stood to gain. But that is a conversation for another day. Today, you should simply enjoy what you've built." The celebration stretched long into the evening, the courtyard glowing warm with lantern light, while guests lingered over food and quiet conversation. And it was well past the point where most of the formal guests had begun drifting toward their cars, that Jessica finally found a moment alone with Do-hyun, standing together near the koi pond at the edge of the garden, Faith finally asleep against Mrs. Yoon's shoulder, somewhere inside the estate. The noise of the celebration softened into distant, contented murmur behind them. "Husband," Jessica said, testing the word with a small, private smile, watching the way it landed on him. "Wife?" Do-hyun returned, something in his voice carrying a warmth she suspected she would never entirely stop finding new ways to be moved by. "I have wanted to call you that properly for longer than I think I let myself admit, even to you. I have something to tell you," Jessica said, and something in her tone made him turn to look at her fully, reading, as he always did, the particular quality of her stillness before she said anything important. "I wasn't going to say anything tonight. I thought it should wait for a quieter moment, something that belonged entirely to us. But I don't think I can hold it in any longer, and I don't think there's ever going to be a quieter moment than this one." "Tell me," Do-hyun said, and something careful and hopeful moved behind his eyes. "I went to see the doctor 3 days ago," Jessica said, "before Yoo-jin's call, before all of it. I wanted to be certain before I said anything, because I didn't want to give you something and then have to take it away again." She took his hand and pressed it, gently, against her stomach, watching his face as understanding moved slowly, beautifully across it. "I'm pregnant, Do-hyun. We're going to have another child." For a long moment, Do-hyun simply stood there, his hand resting against her stomach, his face working through something too large for immediate words, and when he finally spoke, his voice had cracked entirely open, every careful discipline he'd built across a lifetime in that difficult world falling away completely. "Jessica," he said, and it was barely more than a breath. "Are you certain?" "Completely certain," she said, smiling through the tears that had started again. Entirely different tears than the ones she'd cried at the altar hours earlier. "Faith is going to have a little brother or sister, Do-hyun. Ours. Not strategy, not leverage, not anything but exactly what it is. A child we made because we love each other." Do-hyun pulled her into him then, holding her the way she imagined he had wanted to hold her for a very long time, careful of the space between them dissolving entirely into something neither strategic nor careful, just pure and unguarded and entirely his. "On our wedding day," he said, his voice muffled against her hair, thick with an emotion she had genuinely never heard from him before. "You are going to spend the rest of our marriage telling this story, aren't you? The day I married you and found out we were expecting, in the same 24 hours. Every single anniversary," Jessica promised, laughing through her own tears now, feeling the particular fullness of a joy she had once genuinely believed she would never be permitted to feel again, after that wedding hall doorway, after the cold street, after everything the last year and a half had asked of her. "You'll be sick of hearing it by our 10th anniversary, and I'm still going to tell it." They stood together by the koi pond for a long while after that, the lanterns glowing soft and gold around them, the last of the wedding guests drifting home into the Seoul evening, and Jessica let herself simply exist inside the moment, fully, completely, without the careful vigilance that had governed nearly every significant moment of her life since the night she'd walked into that first wedding hall doorway. There would be more to navigate ahead, she knew. There always was, in the world Do-hyun had built and that she had chosen, with open eyes, to build alongside him. But tonight, standing here as his wife in every sense of the word, carrying the beginning of another life inside her, watching him look at her like she was the single most extraordinary thing he had ever been given, Jessica Choi felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that she had finally, completely, arrived exactly where she was always meant to be. The months that followed the wedding unfolded with a particular sweetness Jessica had never quite let herself imagine possible. Not during the anxious, solitary months of her first pregnancy, and not even in the quieter, careful joy of carrying Faith while learning, day by day, to trust the strange new life she'd stepped into. This time, every appointment was one Do-hyun attended personally, rearranging entire business schedules without a second thought, sitting beside her in waiting rooms with the same unhurried patience he brought to everything, asking the doctor careful, thorough questions that made the physician, an older woman named Dr. Han, who had delivered half the network's children over the decades, remark more than once that she had rarely seen a father quite so determined not to miss a single detail. It was Dr. Han, in fact, who delivered the news that sent the entire household into a particular kind of joyful chaos, sitting across from them at the 12-week appointment with an expression that suggested she was rather enjoying withholding information for the length of exactly one dramatic pause. "Before I show you the images," she said, "I should tell you both to sit down, if you aren't already sitting." "We're sitting," Do-hyun said, and Jessica felt his hand tighten slightly around hers, the particular tension of a man bracing himself for news he couldn't yet categorize as good or difficult. "Twins," Dr. Han said simply, turning the monitor toward them, and for a moment, neither of them said anything at all, both of them simply staring at the screen, at the two distinct, unmistakable shapes nestled there. Before Do-hyun made a sound Jessica had genuinely never heard from him before, something caught halfway between a laugh and something rawer, and pulled her hand to his lips. "Twins," he repeated, as though testing whether the word might change if he said it aloud himself. Jessica, we're having twins. I think Faith is about to become a very outnumbered older sister, Jessica said, laughing through the particular overwhelmed joy of the moment. And Do-hyun laughed too, real and unguarded, the sound filling the small examination room in a way that made Dr. Han smile and quietly excuse herself to give them a moment alone with the news. They told Faith that evening, sitting together on the floor of her nursery while she stacked wooden blocks with the fierce, uneven concentration of a toddler who had recently discovered the particular satisfaction of building things only to knock them down again. And though at not quite 2 years old, she understood only fragments of what her parents were explaining. The word babies seemed to land somewhere meaningful, because she abandoned her blocks entirely and pressed both small hands flat against Jessica's stomach with an expression of such serious, careful concentration that Do-hyun had to look away for a moment to compose himself. 2 babies, Jessica told her, guiding her daughter's hands gently. You're going to have a little brother and a little sister, both at the same time. Faith considered this information with the particular gravity small children reserve for concepts they don't quite grasp but recognize, instinctively, as important, and then looked up at her mother with wide, serious eyes. Mine? She asked. Yours, Do-hyun confirmed, scooping her up into his arms. Something in his voice, thick with an emotion Jessica had watched him grow steadily less careful about hiding over the past year and a half. Both of them, entirely yours, exactly the way you're entirely ours. Word had reached Cho Young-tae's faction within the founding council long before the twins' arrival, delivered through the same careful, deliberate channels Do-hyun had used to dismantle every threat that had ever been directed at his family. And the resolution, when it finally came, arrived not through violence, which had never truly been Do-hyun's method, but through the far more devastating currency of Seoul's oldest world: exposure, leverage, and the quiet, methodical removal of every advantage Cho Young-tae had spent years accumulating. Elder Baek, true to his word, had convened the founding council within weeks of the wedding, and the details of exactly what was said in that closed session never fully reached Jessica, though she understood enough, through the particular satisfaction that settled over Do-hyun in the days that followed, to know that Cho Young-tae's ambitions within the network had been permanently, comprehensively curtailed, his standing among the older families reduced to something that would take him decades, if he ever managed it at all, to rebuild. He will not trouble us again, Do-hyun told her simply one evening not long after, and something in the steady certainty of his voice was enough for Jessica to let the matter rest entirely, trusting, as she had learned to trust across the length of their marriage, that when Do-hyun told her something was handled, it was handled completely. The pregnancy progressed with a gentleness Jessica had not experienced the first time, surrounded now by an entire household that had rearranged itself around her comfort without her ever needing to ask. Mrs. Yoon fussing over her diet with the same fierce devotion she'd once brought to wedding preparations. Do-hyun learning, through careful trial and error, exactly which foods settled her stomach on difficult mornings, and which conversations were best saved for evenings when she had energy to spare. Faith, meanwhile, had taken to pressing her small ear against Jessica's growing stomach at random intervals throughout the day, announcing with great seriousness whenever she believed she'd heard something. And though Jessica strongly suspected her daughter was hearing nothing more than the ordinary sounds of her own small imagination, she never once corrected her, simply let Faith believe she was already, in her own particular way, getting to know her siblings. They chose the names together, deliberately, over several long evenings spent at the low table in the sitting room where so much of their story had already unfolded. Jessica bringing forward names that carried the weight of her own grandmother's memory and the particular resilience of the women who had raised her. Do-hyun offering names that honored his father's legacy without repeating it exactly. Both of them working, patiently, towards something that belonged entirely to the family they were building, rather than to either of their pasts alone. For the boy, Jessica said one evening, watching the lantern light flicker across Do-hyun's face, I keep coming back to Daniel. It was my grandfather's name, back in Lagos. It means God is my judge. I like the idea of a name that carries a kind of built-in reminder that no one else gets to decide his worth for him. Daniel, Do-hyun repeated slowly, testing it the way he tested most things that mattered to him. I'd like to give him a Korean name as well, if that's something you'd want. Not instead of Daniel. Alongside it. I'd love that, Jessica said. What were you thinking? Do-hyun, he said quietly. It was my father's middle name. I never expected to feel the particular pull of wanting to pass something like that forward until I actually became a father myself, and now I find I want very badly to give our son something of my father's, something small, something that keeps a piece of him present in this family, even though he never lived to see any of it. Jessica reached across the table and took his hand. Daniel Do-hyun, she said softly. It's perfect. For the girl, the decision came more easily, arriving almost simultaneously to both of them. One evening, while they watched Faith attempt, with great determination, to teach Mrs. Yoon's small dog an entirely invented game, whose rules seemed to shift according to the dog's evident confusion. Grace, Jessica said, watching her daughter's fierce, joyful concentration. Because that's exactly what all of this has felt like to me, Do-hyun. Grace I never expected to receive, arriving anyway. Grace, Do-hyun agreed, something soft and certain in his voice. And for a Korean name, I'd like to offer Ha-eun, if you're willing. It means grace given, kindness bestowed. It feels almost too fitting to ignore. Grace Ha-eun, Jessica said, feeling the names settle into place exactly the way she'd hoped they would, carrying forward the truest parts of both of their histories, blended now into something entirely new. Our daughter. The twins arrived on a bright spring morning, nearly 9 months to the day after the wedding, in the same private hospital wing where Faith had been born, surrounded this time not by careful, anxious uncertainty, but by the full, joyful weight of a family that had fought its way, deliberately and honestly, into exactly the life it now stood inside of. Do-hyun did not pace the hallway this time, though Jessica suspected the impulse remained somewhere underneath his composure. Instead, he stayed beside her through every hour of labor, his hand steady in hers, murmuring quiet encouragement in a mixture of Korean and the halting, earnest phrases of English he'd spent months practicing specifically for this moment. Determined, he told her later, not to let his own nervousness show in a language she'd have to work to translate. Daniel arrived first, just past dawn, small and furious in exactly the way his older sister had been, announcing his arrival into the world with a cry loud enough to make Do-hyun laugh through visible tears, and Grace followed 4 minutes later, quieter, watchful, her dark eyes open and alert almost immediately, in a way the nurses remarked was unusual for a newborn, studying the room around her with an expression Jessica would later swear, with great affectionate certainty, was already unmistakably her father's. Mrs. Yoon, waiting in the hallway with Faith perched on her hip, was permitted in once both babies had been cleaned and settled, and the older woman burst into tears the moment she crossed the threshold, pressing a trembling hand to her mouth exactly as she had the morning Jessica and Do-hyun announced their engagement, overwhelmed all over again by the particular fullness of watching a family she had come to love as her own grow larger still. 2, she managed finally, wiping at her eyes. I told the driver. I said, watch, it will be 2. This family does nothing by half measures anymore. And despite the exhaustion pulling at every part of her body, Jessica laughed, real and warm, feeling the particular joy of being surrounded by people who had chosen, deliberately and repeatedly, to stay. Faith sat down carefully beside the bed, approached with the same serious concentration she'd brought to pressing her ear against Jessica's stomach for months, peering first at Daniel, then at Grace, with an expression of profound, toddler-sized deliberation, before finally announcing, with great satisfaction, mine, exactly as she had the evening they'd first told her about the babies, and something about hearing her claim her siblings so completely, so instantly, without a single moment of the jealousy or uncertainty Jessica had privately worried about, settled something warm and permanent into her chest. Yours, Do-hyun agreed, lifting Faith carefully onto the edge of the bed so she could see both babies properly, his other arm still wrapped protectively around Jessica's shoulders. All 3 of them, entirely yours, and entirely ours, Faith. This is the family we built. The years that followed unfolded the way real years do, full of ordinary joys and ordinary difficulties. Daniel and Grace growing alongside their older sister in a household that had, against every possible expectation, become one of the most quietly respected within the entirety of Seoul's oldest, most careful world. Not because of the leverage their bloodline carried, though that leverage remained, protected and formidable, exactly as Do-hyun had promised on the very first night they'd met, but because of the particular reputation the family earned for itself across years of consistent, deliberate honesty in a world built almost entirely on the opposite. Elder Baek, in the years before his death, became something Jessica had never expected to find in that old, careful man. A genuine, if characteristically dry, friend. One who visited the estate regularly to watch the children grow, who once told Jessica, near the end of his long life, that watching her and Do-hyun build their family had restored something in his understanding of what the founding families were actually meant to protect, beyond simple wealth and influence. Madame Kwan never did soften toward Jessica, not fully, not in any way that erased the particular coldness she had shown across the years of the first marriage, but she did, eventually, once Tae-min had spent enough years demonstrating the slow, genuine change his own reckoning had forced upon him, allow her son a careful, limited relationship with Faith, who grew up understanding the full, complicated truth of her origins, exactly as her mother had promised, choosing, with the same fierce clarity she carried into everything, precisely how much space she wanted her biological father to occupy in her life, and precisely how much she didn't. Han Yoo-jin and Jessica never became close, exactly, the wounds between them too old and too specific to fully dissolve into anything as simple as friendship, but they maintained, across the years, a careful, respectful correspondence, the particular grace of 2 women who had once been positioned against each other by a man neither of them, in the end, had genuinely wanted, choosing instead to acknowledge what each had eventually cost and learn from the collision of their lives. And Jessica herself, the woman who had once stood barefoot on a cold Seoul street, with nothing but a crumpled invitation and a certainty that her entire life had just ended, built something across the following years that she had genuinely stopped believing, on that worst night, she would ever again be permitted to have. A family built entirely on chosen honesty. 3 children who grew up watching their parents choose each other, deliberately and repeatedly, in ways neither performed nor obligatory, and a partnership that had begun, improbably, as a cold negotiation over terms and conditions, and had become, across years of careful, consistent proof, the truest love she had ever known. Some nights, standing on the same wooden veranda where Do-hyun had once told her the strategic value had stopped mattering somewhere around the third week, watching Daniel and Grace chase each other through the garden, while Faith, older now, sat reading nearby with the same fierce concentration she'd brought to everything since toddlerhood. Jessica would think back to that wedding hall doorway, to the crushed invitation in her fist, to the particular cold certainty that her life had simply ended, and marvel at exactly how wrong that certainty had turned out to be. Because some betrayals, she had learned, across every year that followed that terrible night, don't actually end anything at all. They simply clear the ground for something far truer to grow, if you're brave enough, in the aftermath, to keep choosing yourself, keep demanding honesty, keep refusing to accept anyone's word for what you're worth. She had walked out of that wedding hall, believing she had lost everything that mattered. She had, instead, walked directly toward the family she was always meant to build, one honest choice at a time, with a man who had never once, not in all the years that followed, given her a single reason to doubt him. Thank you for spending this time with me. If you wish this story could keep going, it can. The Ultimate Mafia Boss Love Collection includes 15 complete stories, 20 audiobooks, and 5 exclusive bonus stories created especially for true Afro-Korean romance fans. Click the link in the description or simply scan the QR code by pausing the video and opening your phone's camera to get instant access in just a few moments. I can't wait for you to discover your next favorite love story. If this story moved you today, if you found yourself rooting for Jessica and Do-hyun through every twist, every threat, every quiet, hard-won victory, from that very first devastating moment in the wedding hall all the way through to the family they built with their own 2 hands, I want you to do something for me right now. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, because we have so many more stories like this one waiting for you every single week. Drop a comment below and tell me honestly which moment in this story hit you hardest: the wedding hall betrayal, the veranda confession, or watching Faith claim her new brother and sister as entirely her own. I read every single one of your comments, and I genuinely love hearing how these stories land with you. Like this video if you want to see more stories about women who refuse to let anyone else write the terms of their own lives. And if you're new here, welcome to the family, because we tell stories exactly like this one every single week. And trust me, you do not want to miss what's coming next. Until then, stay strong, stay hopeful, and never let anyone in any room, anywhere, ever convince you that the worst night of your life is the end of your story. Sometimes, if you're brave enough to keep walking forward, it's only the very beginning. I'll see you in the next story.